Chapter 4 of Dr. John Dee, Elizabethan Mystic and Astrologer, by G.M. Hort. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. The long journey, which began ominously enough with a narrow escape from shipwreck, was continued overland with many hardships and delays. Travel in those days of cumbrous traveling coaches was not, at the best, easy, and these travelers were further encumbered with women, children, and heavy baggage. No wonder that, in a strange vision of Kelly's at Lubeck, which they reached early in November, an apparition in kingly raiment exhorted Dee to pluck up his heart and pine not away with inward groaning. This apparition, one of a company of 11, seems rather to have been a phantasm of the living than a messenger from the other world, and to have represented some royal patron who was waiting to receive and reward the travelers. But Dee obviously distrusted the dazzling promises of riches and fame, and asked in pathetic words for guidance. Winter was setting in, and traveling was increasingly toilsome. There was a suggestion that Lasky should go on before, leaving the others to follow, when spring came. But Dee thought this would be unfair to the prince, and so they made shift to push forward. In the vision at Lubeck, Dee also received dark warnings about the house at Mortlake, left in the ineffective charge of Mistress Dee's brother. It may be that thy house may be burnt. As a matter of fact, though the house was still standing, it was, at or about this time, broken into by a hostile mob which destroyed all it could lay hands on of the magician's precious books and instruments. Still, no thought of returning seems to have entered into Dee's mind. Early in February they reached Lask, the prince's estate, near Krakow, and here again came visions in the crystal, and presently news, through the voice of Madimi, that all was well at Mortlake, and that the queen was still Dee's friend. At Krakow, whither the travelers soon removed, Kelly, in his anxiety about money, tried to scry a loan, but was reproved and baffled by a spirit known as Nalvich. The description of this spirit, by the way, recalls the young King Edward VI, so possibly we have here an invocation of the dead. Then followed some weeks of investigations after Dee's own heart. Nalvich and Gabriel spoke in some mystical language, and gave mystical information which Kelly did not understand, and which filled him with angry impatience. Again he declared that he would scry no more, and again Dee persuaded and calmed him. The old Polish town of Krakow must have held much that was congenial and inspiring to Dee. The travelers lodged near a church, and the angelic voices counseled to acts of ceremonial piety, such as church-going and the observance of holy days, things always dear to the pious scholar. At Krakow also came the curious vision of 4 castles, which a spirit known as Ave interpreted as watchtowers provided against the devil. There was a castle for each point of the compass, and each was in the care of a mighty angel, so that the whole world appeared in the vision as under the protection of these invisible citadels and their garrisons. Much time and trouble were spent in drawing an elaborate diagram representing all this, and Dee would have been content to hear much more of the good angels, their names and functions. But Lasky was already restless at the lack of practical results, and with a view to hastening these, insisted that Dee and Kelly should proceed to Prague and see the Emperor Rudolph, son of that Maximilian to whom Dee had dedicated his monas. To Prague they went accordingly in the late summer, leaving the women and children in Krakow. But Rudolph, an eccentric and moody man, heard with thinly veiled impatience Dee's long and rambling story of angelic visions, and Uriel's reported message to himself to forsake his sins and turn to God, could have done little to increase his cordiality. He was civil, but committed himself to nothing, and in spite of the friendship formed with Dee by Dr. Curtius, a learned member of the council, and much kindness from the Spanish ambassador, the stay in Prague was not profitable. It was, however, a prolonged stay. The women and children came on from Krakow, and in the spring of 1584 another son was born to Dee, to be named Michael, after the great archangel, and to receive baptism in Prague Cathedral. Dee urged on Rudolph the great opportunity the emperor was neglecting. He and Kelly, if Rudolph would but be their patron, would use the power of projection to enrich him beyond the dreams of avarice. But Rudolph remained cold and, as Curtius said to Dee, regarded such things as impossible of belief without proof. In April 1584 return was made for a short time to Poland, and at Krakow Lasky presented his protégés to King Stefan Bathory, generally known as Stephen the Great. Stephen received them courteously, and some experiments with the crystal were attempted in his presence, but these were apparently not successful. At any rate, Stephen was even more unresponsive than Rudolf, and the wanderers had no choice but to return once more to Prague. And here they were not to be suffered to rest. The Pope's nuncio at Rudolf's court was thundering now against the scandal of their presence, and the magicians were bidden to quit the city and the emperor's dominions within 6 days. At this crisis of indignity, however, they found a new patron and a new refuge. Count Wilhelm Rosenberg, Viceroy of Bohemia, interested himself with Rudolf in their behalf, and invited them to his castle in Tribau or Tribona, in South Bohemia. This was a pleasant place surrounded by pleasant country, and Dee records with satisfaction the goodly chapel next my chamber, where the scrying was resumed. A few months later Dee received an invitation from the Emperor of Russia to enter his service and to come to live at his court at Moscow, but the scholar, though highly gratified, refused. He desired no engagement that would bind him to a foreign prince, and under Rosenberg's protection he was enjoying comparative peace and comfort. At Tribona, progress of a kind seems at last to have been made. Kelly's much talked of powder of projection is said to have produced gold, and Dee rejoiced in his companion's triumph, and wrote of it exultingly to Walsingham. But now Kelly was finally resolved to have done with the crystal gazing, the full record of which, both at Mortlake and abroad, had been kept by Dee in the aforementioned Book of Mysteries, or Spiritual Diary. We may here say of this remarkable book that it is strange that anyone who carefully read it could have subscribed to the theory, once popular, that Dee made use of the mystical method of writing to conceal political secrets, and that he accompanied Lasky to Poland as Elizabeth's agent and political spy. For the records could only have been kept by a true enthusiast, a spiritualist of deepest sincerity and faith. While Kelly gazed into the showstone, Dee would often be wrapped in prayer, suspending his duties of noting what was seen and heard to murmur fervent intercessions for himself and others, now in English, now in Latin, and always in dignified and reverent words. He could idealize the crudest details of the actions, as when a certain spirit who appeared wearing jewelry asked if they thought her a jeweler's wife, and Dee answered calmly that they thought her the messenger of him who purchased the jewels of eternal bliss by the jewel of his precious blood. Here and in many another place, Dee does not seem far from the standpoint of those mystics who allegorized the philosopher's stone itself into a type of Christ. But for Kelly, spiritual studies were valuable according to their power of increasing material comforts. He had never loved visions for their own sake, and now they were an obvious waste of time that might be profitably spent on transmutation. In vain the angelic voices told him that his gift of clairvoyancy was of more worth than earthly treasure. He remained obdurate, and Dee reluctantly consecrated, with his habitual prayers for God's blessing on the work, young Arthur Dee in his stead. But Arthur, who was only between 7 and 8 years of age, proved a very poor substitute. His bewildered child eyes saw nothing of significance in the crystal. Then Kelly was persuaded to scry once more, but felt, or professed to feel, reluctance to tell his vision. It was certainly a subject for shame, as Dee calls it, a hard and impure doctrine. According to Kelly, Madimi, and a spirit known to them as Il, were persistently counseling that he and Dee must share all things in common, not excepting their 2 wives. Both in and out of the crystal they had appeared to him, conveying this message by dumb show and by words. And Uriel, the spirit of light, the angel of God, had also appeared with the same horrible counsel. Dee was confounded. He does not seem to have accepted the explanation which most spiritualists of his piety would accept nowadays, namely, that such evil advice came from demons, disguised in the shape of angels of light. He preferred, after the first horrified protests, to view the idea as an allegory of closer spiritual union among the 4, and he drew up a document which was a virtual consent, in which the 4 signed. He has been vehemently blamed for this, but deluded as he was, we must acquit him of all evil intentions, and, so far as we know, there was no attempt on the part of anyone of the 4 to carry out the impotent suggestion. Kelly indeed was fully occupied with more ambitious projects. As Miss Fell-Smith observes, he had no idea of sharing anything with his master. The great secret of transmutation he kept jealously to himself, and cunningly increased his own prestige with Rosenberg, in whose eyes the older sage, with his slow, painstaking methods, was gradually becoming a mere shadow of the younger, bolder one. Dee was never invited now to share the alchemical counsels of the Count and Kelly. The scrying in the goodly chapel was entirely at an end. Saddened and humiliated, Dee's thoughts turned towards England, whither Elizabeth had already invited him to return. He wrote her a stately letter congratulating her on the defeat of the Spanish Armada, then, in the spring of 1859, gathered his goods together, and set out from Trebona with his family, further now increased by the birth of another son, Theodore. They had been at Trebona a year and a half. Another year and 3/4 was to elapse before they reached England, so that their absence extended altogether to 6 years. Dee fully expected Kelly to join and embark with him, and after a sojourn of several months in Bremen, waited long for the younger man at Stade, the port of Bremen. But he waited in vain. Kelly had no intention of returning to England, and later, return was put out of his power. Dee in England was to hear from time to time dazzling rumors of his success in the making of gold, and of honors he could never have hoped to gain in his own native country. Later came a story of swift and sudden disgrace, imprisonment, and finally death in prison, possibly by violence, possibly by his own hand. Characteristically, the old scholar mourned for his treacherous friend, saw him sometimes in dreams, and in his own last days spoke regretfully of the wondrous things they had experienced together. But they never met again. The strange fellowship was ended. It is hardly necessary to say that of the annual sum of money promised to Dee when he left Bohemia, not a penny was ever received. End of chapter 4.